In the shadowed hollows of Appalachia, there exists a history too dark to appear in textbooks, too unsettling to be spoken aloud. Between 1870 and 1890, 18 men vanished without a trace across the ridges and valleys of Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky. They disappeared from farmsteads, from taverns, from forested paths in the glare of daylight. No bodies were found, no warnings were left behind. Nothing connected these men in the eyes of the law, except for one secret that authorities refused to document, a truth deliberately erased from the records. Each man had wronged the Melungeons, the forgotten people of the mountains, in ways that demanded repayment. The Melungeons were neither white nor enslaved, neither fully recognized as native nor European. Their ancestors had inhabited Appalachia for generations, their bloodlines a tangle of mysteries, their existence a living paradox to those obsessed with categorization. Olive and bronze skin, eyes that sometimes startled with icy clarity against dark hair, voices shaped by centuries of isolation. These people moved through the mountains like shadows. To the outsiders, they were anomalies, inconvenient anomalies that the law and society sought to erase. But they remembered. Oh, they remembered every betrayal, every stolen homestead, every family displaced by the greed of men who wore suits and wielded courts as weapons. By the 1870s, the survivors had become patient. They had learned that justice in Appalachia was a performance, a stage on which the powerful acted while the powerless suffered. But the Melungeons were not powerless. They had knowledge the newcomers could not hope to comprehend: the forests, the caves, the hidden hollows where sunlight feared to linger. They knew silence, observation, and precision. They would take revenge, but not impulsively, not like ordinary men. Their vengeance would be methodical, surgical, invisible, and absolute. Before we descend further into this story, do something for yourself. Subscribe and leave a comment with your city or state. It's more than etiquette. It is a record that your consciousness has touched a secret few dare confront. And if you want to bind the truth you are about to witness, type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments. Let it echo in your mind. Let it settle. The first vanishings were quiet, unremarkable even. A man riding home from a distant market simply never arrived. A small timber investor disappeared while inspecting a new claim. No witnesses, no struggle, nothing. And yet, the mountains remembered. The forests recorded the movements of the hunters. The Melungeons waited, patient as the ridges themselves. What you are about to hear is pieced together from family journals, abandoned cabins, letters hidden in trunks. The story that unfolds is not just about murder. It is about a people erased, a vengeance centuries in the making, and the relentless shadows of justice executed beyond the reach of law. The Melungeons' story did not begin with disappearance, nor with blood. It began with land, with ownership, with the slow erosion of rights that had taken place over decades. In the early 1800s, settlers moved deeper into the Appalachian backcountry, encountering families that did not fit their expectations, families that spoke a strange, almost archaic English, who farmed rocky ridges, who lived in isolation yet thrived. Names like Collins, Goins, Gibson, and Mullins were etched into the valleys, whispered among neighbors as curiosities or threats. Their land was good, their knowledge of the mountains unmatched. But outsiders saw opportunity, and opportunity became violence cloaked in legality. Legal maneuvering became the first weapon against the Melungeons. Surveys were redrawn, titles challenged, deeds rendered meaningless by the letter of the law. Wealthy landowners and timber interests moved quietly but ruthlessly, stripping entire families of property, burning cabins that had stood for generations. The Collins family, for example, lost a 100-acre farm that had belonged to them for 3 generations. The judge ruled it invalid because the family was mixed blood. And just like that, a life's work vanished in flames, the smoke curling into the cold Appalachian sky like a warning. Zachariah Collins, a boy of 19, watched as his father's labor and his mother's hope turned to ash. The memory never left him, and he would carry it like a weapon hidden in plain sight. By the end of the Civil War, dozens of Melungeon families had been displaced, humiliated, and left to eke out survival on the steepest, most inhospitable slopes. They were isolated, invisible to the outside world, and yet they had one thing the oppressors could never take: time. Time to remember, time to plan, time to wait. And they did wait. Generations had moved quietly through these mountains, learning the language of stealth and patience. Every whispered conversation, every passing observation in the markets, every glance at a map or survey became a piece of intelligence, a blueprint for a reckoning that no court could judge. By the 1870s, the first seeds of action had been planted. Small, secret meetings took place in cabins tucked away in hollows and forests. Men of the Melungeon bloodlines gathered under the cover of night, discussing the men who had stolen land, burned homes, and destroyed lives. They called themselves nothing, wrote nothing, and swore no oaths that could betray them. Every word, every name, every plan existed only in memory, circulating silently among those who would see justice executed when the time was right. Before we descend into the first vanishing, remember this. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location, for it matters to know where witnesses of forbidden knowledge dwell. And for those ready to imprint this truth into their own consciousness, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Let it take root. Let it align your awareness with the hidden currents of history that the world pretends never existed. The first men to vanish were far from random. They were chosen carefully, their habits noted, their vulnerabilities mapped. The mountains themselves conspired with the Melungeons, providing shadows and winding trails where no outsider could follow. Justice would be patient, justice would be perfect, and justice would be invisible. By 1872, the first disappearance would announce the Melungeons' reckoning. Ephraim Dalton, a prosperous land speculator who had seized the Collins farm decades earlier, was the first to vanish. Dalton had built a life of comfort and respectability in Hancock County, his wealth bolstered by the very crimes that had displaced Melungeon families. He dined in fine hotels, attended county meetings, and rode the same forest paths that had once witnessed the destruction of a people. He never suspected that those paths had been memorized, catalogued, and prepared by those he had wronged. The night of his disappearance was clear and cold. Dalton left the Hancock Hotel, intending to retrieve his horse before riding home. His steps echoed against the silent buildings of Sneedville, yet there was no sound of pursuit, no cry of warning, no struggle. By dawn he was gone. His horse remained tethered, his saddle and belongings untouched. The sheriff investigated, of course, briefly, perfunctorily. But there was no evidence, nothing. Dalton had been erased as if he had never existed, and yet, up on Newman's Ridge, the silence spoke volumes. The Melungeons knew that patience was as important as precision. Zechariah Collins, now a man hardened by memory and time, observed quietly, a shadow among the ridges. He thought of his father, of the fire that had consumed their home, of the injustices endured by neighbors and cousins. Dalton's disappearance was not random vengeance. It was a message, both to the outside world and to the descendants who would follow the same path. The mountains had chosen to conceal, and the Melungeons had chosen to execute with surgical perfection. This was not the work of murderers in haste. Every target was carefully studied. Habits, routes, routines, all were documented silently through observation and whispers. Children playing in the woods, women selling produce in town, men tending their own farms. They became the eyes and ears of a network that could not be traced. When the moment came, the Melungeons moved with the inevitability of the ridge itself. There was no confrontation, no opportunity for resistance. The mountains absorbed the act, preserving the secret for generations. Before we continue, take a moment. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location. Your presence marks the global echo of this hidden history. And for those who wish to internalize the truth of these events, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Let it settle. Let it root in your awareness, for understanding this story is not passive. It changes perception. Dalton was only the beginning. Over the following decade, men who had enriched themselves at the expense of the Melungeons began to vanish. Some from homes, some from streets in daylight. Each disappearance followed the same precise choreography, observed, isolated, removed, and erased. No trace remained, no explanation satisfied law or society. And the people of the mountains continued their silent vigil, the slow accumulation of justice that would define the lost tribe's dark legacy. As the 1870s unfolded, the Melungeons' network of watchers expanded quietly, invisibly, almost imperceptibly. Their vigilance was not organized in a way outsiders could recognize. There were no councils, no written logs, no formal meetings. Instead, the community functioned like a living organism, each individual a cell within a body that remembered every wrong, catalogued every betrayal, and prepared for the day when vengeance would be executed. Every whispered conversation in a market, every glance exchanged on a forest path, every unnoticed footprint was part of a larger intelligence, flowing back to the ridges, informing the decisions of those who had waited decades for retribution. By 1875, the second disappearance had taken place. Tobias Fletcher, a surveyor whose maps had displaced multiple Melungeon families, vanished one late evening after closing his small store. Fletcher lived alone, his life orderly, predictable. The mountains, the forests, the hidden hollows that only the Melungeons knew intimately, conspired with his hunters. He simply did not return from the short walk to his cabin. His store remained locked. No door forced, no window broken, nothing taken. The sheriff's investigation lasted less than a week, and like Dalton before him, Fletcher was quietly written out of existence by those who claimed the authority to keep order. But the act itself was only part of the lesson. The Melungeons understood that vengeance was not merely punishment, it was a transformation. Each disappearance sent ripples through the minds of the community that had once profited from theft and violence. Fear became a constant companion. Those who had assumed their crimes were hidden learned that the mountains could watch, and that even decades of assumed security were an illusion. The Melungeons' patience had created a web of inevitability, a lesson as much psychological as physical. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Let it settle in your consciousness. And while you do, subscribe and comment your location. The act of acknowledging these stories is more than ritual. It is participation in a truth that has been intentionally erased. With Fletcher's disappearance, the pattern became clear to anyone willing to observe. Men who had harmed Melungeon families vanished, one by one, always under circumstances that left no evidence, no witness, no explanation. Each act was deliberate, a carefully choreographed erasure designed to deliver justice far beyond the reach of law. And yet, for the people of the mountains, it was not enough merely to remove them. It was necessary to ensure that memory, fear, and caution spread like shadow through the valleys. This was only the beginning. By studying habits, routines, and vulnerabilities, the Melungeons were crafting not a series of murders, but a lesson written in absence. They were writing a history in reverse, taking back what had been stolen, erasing those who had taken it, and embedding the consequences of wrongdoing into the very consciousness of a region that had forgotten them. By the late 1870s, the Melungeons had transformed from a hunted, isolated people into the architects of an invisible reckoning. Every disappearance was a message, every vanishing a lesson etched into the consciousness of those who had once assumed power over them. In March of 1878, Benjamin Chadwick disappeared. A deputy sheriff in the 1850s, he had enforced eviction orders against Melungeon families with brutal enthusiasm. He had once declared that the Ridge people needed to learn their place or be taught it. That March evening, as Chadwick rode between Kingsport and Rogersville, the mountains watched him. The same forests that had witnessed the destruction of homes now concealed the patient hands of retribution. Chadwick was never seen again. His horse returned, his saddle untouched. Nothing about his passage through the wilderness betrayed the violence that had claimed him. And yet, the disappearance did not shock the Melungeons. They had anticipated it. Each act of vengeance was preceded by careful observation. Routes were mapped, habits memorized, every weakness catalogued. The mountains themselves became a tool, a labyrinth where only those with intimate knowledge could move safely. Outsiders, no matter their strength, their weapons, their connections, were unprepared for the cunning patience of a people who had been ignored, ridiculed, and erased for generations. Zachariah Collins, now in his mid-40s, sat atop a ridge overlooking the valley where his father's farm once thrived. He remembered the fire, the stolen deeds, the humiliation, and the grief that had aged his mother's face before her years. Now he watched the ripple effects of justice unfold. The Melungeons were not merely taking back what had been stolen, they were shaping a psychological map that extended beyond property and blood. Fear, unease, and uncertainty became their instruments, teaching those who had once wielded law like a weapon that every action, every cruelty, carried consequences far beyond what they could imagine. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location. It is more than a gesture, it is acknowledgement that you too have touched this hidden history. And for those ready to internalize the power of patience and observation, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Let it imprint on your consciousness as it has imprinted on the mountains. Later that same year, Samuel Pritchard disappeared. He had led a logging crew that destroyed 3 Melungeon families in 1862. His vanishing was as silent as a shadow passing through a darkened hollow. No struggle, no trace, no explanation. Each disappearance reinforced the invisible architecture of justice the Melungeons were constructing. An untraceable, unyielding force that made every participant in past wrongs acutely aware that no crime against them would ever go unanswered. The mountains held secrets older than law, and within those secrets, the Melungeons were carving a path of vengeance that would stretch across decades, erasing their oppressors one by one while leaving only whispers and fear in their wake. By 1880, the Melungeons' campaign of calculated disappearances had become almost surgical. Leonard Garrett, a magistrate who had signed countless property transfers stripping Melungeon families of land, vanished while fishing along the Powell River in June of that year. His fishing gear was found neatly arranged on the riverbank, untouched. No evidence suggested foul play. No witness recounted seeing him taken. Yet Garrett was gone, as if swallowed by the earth itself. This was not luck or coincidence. This was precision, the result of decades of silent observation, of understanding the rhythms of the mountains, and of turning patience into a weapon far deadlier than any gun. The community that executed these vanishings operated without formal hierarchy. There was no leader who could be hunted, no record that could betray them. Every Melungeon man, woman, and even child who participated did so as a living cell in a body that moved, observed, and remembered collectively. Information was never centralized, yet it flowed efficiently. A man seen traveling alone on a road, a merchant closing a store late, a surveyor walking toward a cabin. Each circumstance became part of a mental map, a blueprint for removal that would leave no trace. The psychological impact was as intentional as the physical act. Men who had wronged the Melungeons began to change their behaviors, almost imperceptibly at first. They walked in groups. They avoided travel at night. They locked their doors. They asked questions cautiously and spoke in guarded tones. Fear, the Melungeons understood, was a tool. It did not merely punish. It reshaped the world for those who had once assumed impunity. Subscribe and comment your location if you haven't yet. By participating even from afar, you acknowledge that these hidden truths are no longer entirely buried. And for those who wish to internalize the rhythm of patient justice, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Let it settle in your consciousness. By 1883, the disappearances were so methodical that outsiders began to whisper about a pattern, but authorities could not connect the dots. 13 men vanished across 3 counties over a decade, yet no body, no witness, no physical trace was ever found. Some men disappeared from their own homes. Others vanished from public spaces in broad daylight. The common thread, invisible to law enforcement, was unmistakable to anyone who knew the mountains and the families that had endured the original injustices. Every victim had profited from the suffering of the Melungeons. The mountains themselves seemed complicit, offering caves, hollowed trees, abandoned mines, and hidden hollows where even the most diligent searchers could not follow. The Melungeons moved through these spaces with a familiarity no outsider could replicate, leaving behind nothing but silence. And as the shadows lengthened over the ridges, a lesson became undeniable: justice, when executed by the patient and the unseen, is a force that cannot be predicted, cannot be contained, and cannot be ignored. By 1885, the Melungeons' campaign had escalated into something almost mythic. Each disappearance was now part of a tapestry woven over decades, an intricate balance of observation, timing, and execution. The mountains held secrets older than any courthouse record, and the people who inhabited them had learned to exploit that secrecy with precision. The victims were not chosen at random. Each man had a history, a ledger of injustices recorded silently by those who would ensure that balance was restored. Benjamin Chadwick, Samuel Pritchard, Leonard Garrett. These names alone were whispers among locals, stories told in hushed tones to children and travelers alike. Men who had once thought themselves untouchable began to feel the shadow of inevitability. The law could not protect them. Neighbors could not protect them. The forests, hollows, and ridges had become instruments of judgment, and the Melungeons, invisible architects of consequence, were masters of this domain. The strategy was always the same: identify the target, observe without intrusion, understand routines, and isolate when the moment was right. The removal itself was silent, almost ceremonial. No struggle, no witnesses, no trace. The mountains absorbed the act, holding it in the dark folds of rock and soil, leaving only questions in its wake. Fear spread like water through the valleys. Not just fear of being caught, but fear of the unseen, the unknowable, the inevitable. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location if you have not yet. Each acknowledgement is a thread connecting the present to this hidden history. And for those prepared to internalize the truth that patience can be a weapon, type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments. Let it imprint itself in your consciousness. By this point, even local newspapers, once indifferent, began to whisper of disappearances, though they never named the Melungeons. Stories circulated of men vanishing from their homes, their farms, and their own doorsteps. Some claimed it was supernatural, others whispered of old grudges. But few dared ask questions aloud. Those who had crossed the Melungeons had learned that their history was not a tale to be ignored. It was a warning, etched invisibly into the land and into the minds of anyone who had harmed these people. The community on Newman's Ridge continued its quiet observation. Young men who had grown up learning the lessons of their ancestors now moved like shadows through the forests. Women and children passed information, memorized routines, and preserved secrets. By the mid-1880s, the Melungeons had constructed not merely a network, but an entire ecosystem of surveillance and judgment. Every disappearance reinforced the rule. Injustice against their people could never be left unpunished. The stage was set for the next wave of vanishing, one that would leave even the bravest men trembling in their homes, wondering if the mountains themselves had eyes, and if the vengeance of the Melungeons was already upon them. By 1887, the mountains were no longer just home to the Melungeons. They were instruments of their judgment. Every ridge, hollow, and hidden path had become part of an invisible grid, a surveillance network that no outsider could map or infiltrate. They moved like ghosts, observed like shadows, and acted like inevitability itself. Their enemies, once secure in wealth and law, were now vulnerable in ways they could neither see nor anticipate. And yet, the Melungeons' actions were never reckless. They were calculated, precise, and deliberately invisible. That year, a man named Horace Caldwell disappeared from a logging camp near Blackwater Creek. Caldwell had been complicit in the eviction of at least 4 Melungeon families and had personally overseen the destruction of homes and property. One morning, he left his tent to inspect the camp's perimeter. By evening, he was gone. His tools, his coat, even the lantern he carried were left behind. His fellow loggers searched the surrounding hills, but the mountains swallowed him completely. Authorities conducted a perfunctory investigation, dismissed it as a runaway, and moved on. But the Melungeons had made their statement. Justice in these mountains was silent, inescapable, and invisible to those who did not understand its methods. The psychological impact was as essential as the act itself. Fear, subtle and pervasive, began to infiltrate the towns and logging camps. Men who had once moved freely, confident in their impunity, now walked in groups, changed routines, and double-checked locks. Rumors spread like wildfire, though the details were always incomplete, never verified. It was enough that the missing men had disappeared. It was enough that the consequence of past crimes against the Melungeons could strike without warning. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to anchor this truth within you. This is not a ritual. It is recognition. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location as well. Even from afar, acknowledging this hidden history connects you to the forces that have been shaping Appalachia's forgotten valleys for generations. By now, the Melungeons were no longer merely avengers. They had become architects of psychological dominance. Every act of disappearance reinforced the lesson that injustice carried a cost, and that cost was absolute. Communities began whispering about a shadow justice, a vengeance that waited patiently, watched silently, and struck without trace. The mountains themselves seemed to breathe with anticipation, carrying the knowledge of centuries of oppression and the patient resolve of those who had survived it. And in the depths of these forests, another disappearance was being planned. The next man on the list would not merely vanish. He would serve as a reminder that no crime against the Melungeons could ever remain unpunished, and that the patient hand of the mountains would always remember. By 1888, the Melungeons had perfected the orchestration of disappearance into an art form. Each target was chosen not randomly, but as part of a calculated sequence, ensuring the lessons of justice would echo across generations. The mountains had become both a sanctuary and a stage. Every ridge, every hollow, every hidden pathway a tool in a strategy that was both practical and psychological. The men who had once held power over the Melungeons now found themselves ensnared in a system they could neither see nor resist. One of the most notorious disappearances occurred that spring. Elias Wentworth, a wealthy timber speculator with direct ties to the displacement of multiple Melungeon families, vanished without a trace while traveling to inspect a logging site near the Powell River. His carriage was found abandoned at the riverbank, the horses unharmed, and his papers left neatly stacked on the seat. The local sheriff reported nothing suspicious, closing the case in under a week. But to the Melungeons, the act was precise justice. Every movement had been studied, every path anticipated, every eventuality accounted for. The mountains had taken what the law could not, and those who had inflicted suffering now faced the invisible consequences. The psychology of fear had become as potent as the disappearances themselves. Men whispered of mountain ghosts, of shadows that watched their every movement. They altered their routines, traveled in groups, and avoided the woods at night. Yet all the precaution in the world could not protect them from the patient, calculated strategy of the Melungeons. Fear was a tool, sharpened with decades of injustice and wielded silently from the shadows. Subscribe and comment your location if you haven't already. And for those who wish to internalize this hidden history, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Acknowledging these truths is an act of understanding, a recognition that the past is never truly gone. It lingers waiting, shaping the present in ways most will never see. By 1889, the network of watchers had extended beyond the original families. Sons and daughters who had grown up with tales of injustice now participated, passing information, observing patterns, and learning the discipline of invisibility. The disappearances were no longer isolated acts. They were the inevitable consequence of violating a community whose memory was long, whose patience was endless, and whose reach, though unseen, was absolute. Each vanishing was more than removal. It was a lesson etched into the valleys and hollows, a psychological imprint that reshaped behavior, sowed caution, and ensured the legacy of the Melungeons would endure. The mountains themselves seemed alive, echoing with the silent power of those who had long been denied justice, preparing for the next act in a decades-long symphony of retribution. By 1890, the Melungeons' methods had evolved beyond mere disappearance into an almost ritualized form of invisible justice. Every vanishing carried with it a lesson. Crime against their community was never forgotten, and patience was as lethal as any weapon. The mountains, their silent witnesses, held the memory of every injustice and every act of vengeance, ensuring that history would repeat itself only in the minds of those who had dared to forget. Samuel Pritchard, one of the logging overseers who had burned out Melungeon families decades prior, became the next mark. On a cool November morning, he left his farm near Cumberland Gap, attending to mundane tasks as though nothing threatened him. By evening he had vanished. His plough remained in the field untended. Doors were closed but not forced. Animals were fed. It was as if the man had simply evaporated into the mist that curled along the ridges. The sheriff documented the disappearance briefly, then closed the case, unaware of the web of vengeance that had orchestrated it. The power of these acts lay not only in removal, but in what they revealed about control. The Melungeons were invisible yet omnipresent. Their vigilance penetrated ordinary life unnoticed. Patterns were observed over months, sometimes years, and targets were isolated with meticulous precision. The mountains themselves became an extension of their consciousness, a labyrinthic network where only those born to the land could operate safely. Outsiders, no matter their strength, their connections, or their law enforcement were helpless. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location if you haven't yet. And for those ready to internalize the rhythm of patient justice, type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments. Let this knowledge settle in your mind. It is a subtle transformation, an awareness of unseen forces shaping the course of history. By 1891, a total of 18 men had disappeared, each tied to crimes against Melungeon families, each leaving behind nothing but questions and fear. The network that had grown organically across Newman's Ridge had ensured that every vanishing was deliberate, every removal a lesson encoded in silence. Communities that had once thought themselves untouchable now moved with caution, aware that the mountains watched and remembered. The Melungeons had become more than a people. They were an idea, a living system of justice that transcended law, documentation, and witness. They demonstrated that patience, knowledge, and intimate understanding of one's environment could produce consequences invisible yet absolute. Each disappearance reinforced the same message: injustice, when left unchecked, becomes an invitation, and the patient will always find a way to answer. By 1892, the aftermath of the disappearances had begun to ripple beyond Newman's Ridge, shaping the behavior and psyche of surrounding communities. The vanished men were not simply lost. They had become cautionary tales, whispered in taverns, told in hushed voices around hearths, a silent curriculum in fear and respect. Those who had once wielded authority over the Melungeons now understood, at a subtle and terrifying level, that power alone could not protect them from the patient intelligence of a people who had nothing left to lose but vengeance to claim. Families in nearby valleys started altering routines instinctively. Loggers and merchants double-checked routes, synchronized movements, and avoided travel alone. Even those who had no direct involvement with the Melungeons sensed the shift, the invisible hand shaping life in the Appalachian foothills. Something had changed, an unseen, pervasive authority that required no words, no laws, no visible force. The Melungeons had reclaimed control, not with armies or courts, but through precision, patience, and the knowledge embedded in generations of survival. Zachariah Collins, now nearing 50, reflected on the decade of disappearances that had unfolded around him. Every vanishing was deliberate, every choice calculated, every consequence exact. He had watched men who had once scorned and oppressed his people vanish without trace, leaving behind a landscape forever altered by fear. And he had seen something even more significant: the invisible architecture of their collective power, an understanding that survival and justice could be intertwined in ways the outside world would never comprehend. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location if you haven't already. The mountains themselves seem to listen, and in acknowledging this history, you connect with a truth that is both hidden and unshakable. For those ready to internalize the lessons of patience and observation, type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments. Let it imprint itself on your awareness as deeply as it has on the forests and ridges of Appalachia. By 1892, the Melungeons had not only exacted revenge, they had shifted the balance of power in the region. The vanishings, 18 in total, were complete in execution but infinite in implication. Fear had become an invisible currency, circulating silently among those who had thought themselves untouchable. Every man who had profited from the dispossession of Melungeon families had learned, too late, that memory and patience can operate as lethally as any weapon. The mountains remained their fortress, the ridges their vantage points, and the forests their untraceable pathways. And as observers in the shadows, they watched how the landscape had changed, not merely physically, but psychologically, socially, and morally. In their quiet, patient way, the Melungeons had ensured that the world that had wronged them would never forget, and that every act of cruelty carried a consequence invisible yet absolute. By 1893, the legacy of the disappearances had seeped into every corner of the Appalachian valleys surrounding Newman's Ridge. The Melungeons were no longer simply a hidden community. They were an omnipresent force, operating in silence, shaping behavior, and asserting control without uttering a word. Those who had once dismissed the tales of vanished men now moved cautiously, aware that the mountains held memory, judgment, and the inevitability of consequence. One particularly chilling account involved a wealthy landowner named Jonathan Thacker, who had profited from evicting Melungeon families decades earlier. Thacker had long believed that age and distance had insulated him from any retribution. In October, while traveling alone to inspect timber he had purchased illegally from the estate of a deceased Melungeon family, he vanished. His carriage was found abandoned in a hollow near Blackwater Creek, his documents intact, his possessions untouched. No body, no blood, no indication of foul play, only absence. This pattern, repeated 18 times now, had become the unspoken law of these valleys. Injustice had a price, and the mountains ensured payment. The psychological impact of these vanishings extended far beyond the individuals themselves. Entire towns altered routines without consciously understanding why. Farmers walked in pairs to markets, merchants kept meticulous track of visitors, and loggers never traveled alone. The Melungeons had transformed the landscape into an invisible theater of consequence, where fear operated as a silent, pervasive teacher. Knowledge of the past had become the weapon of the present, and the lessons were clear. The patient and the observant wield more power than those who rely solely on wealth, authority, or intimidation. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location if you haven't yet. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to cement this knowledge within yourself. Every acknowledgement is a recognition that these truths, hidden for generations, continue to echo in the modern world. By this time, the Melungeons had embedded themselves in the very rhythm of the mountains. Children, taught by their parents about caution, observation, and patience, became silent custodians of knowledge. Every vanishing reinforced the lesson that the past is never truly gone, and that memory, when combined with careful planning, can extend influence across decades. The mountains had become a living testament to their resilience, a silent archive of justice carried out without law, without witness, and without mercy. The disappearances were complete, yet the Melungeons' influence endured far beyond the absence of the men themselves. They had rewritten the social fabric, instilled fear, and demonstrated that survival, knowledge, and patience could operate as forces as absolute as any visible authority. And in that quiet, the unseen power of Newman's Ridge grew ever more formidable, waiting for the next chapter of history to unfold under its shadow. By 1894, the psychological weight of the Melungeons' vengeance had fully taken root in the valleys surrounding Newman's Ridge. The disappearances were more than acts of retribution. They had become a language, a way of communicating power and memory without a single word spoken. Men who had once considered themselves untouchable walked in constant vigilance, their lives dictated by routines designed to avoid the unseen eyes in the mountains. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle in the woods, every unremarkable passerby became a potential observer, a reminder that the mountains remembered and acted with inexorable patience. It was during this period that a man named Silas Harrington disappeared. Harrington had been a magistrate in Hancock County during the 1850s and had played a role in approving numerous property transfers that stripped Melungeon families of their land. By now, the pattern was clear to the community, though outsiders could not see it. Harrington left his home to tend to his livestock and was never seen again. His tools remained in the barn, his dogs were fed, and his house locked as if he had simply stepped out for a brief walk. Law enforcement conducted a perfunctory search but found nothing, no body, no tracks, no clue. And this precisely was the power the Melungeons had mastered: removal without trace, justice without acknowledgement. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location if you haven't yet. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to internalize this knowledge. Every acknowledgement draws you closer to the rhythm of these mountains, to understanding the patience and precision that allowed a small community to enact consequences invisible to the outside world. The network of observers had expanded beyond the original families. Young men and women who had grown up absorbing stories of injustice now participated in the silent vigilance. Children playing along trails, women traveling to market, even the elderly passing through valleys, all became threads in the web of information that flowed back to Newman's Ridge. Every detail was noted, catalogued in memory, and used to ensure that no act of oppression went unpunished. By now, the Melungeons had achieved something extraordinary. They had created a system of influence that transcended law, defied authorities, and operated entirely through understanding, observation, and patience. Fear became a social force, shaping behavior, enforcing caution, and imprinting the consequences of past injustices upon anyone who might threaten them. The disappearances were complete, but the lesson endured, a reminder that memory, patience, and intimate knowledge of the land could enact a form of justice far more absolute than any court could provide. By 1895, the mountains had become both protector and executioner. The Melungeons' network was now so deeply embedded in the valleys that no outsider could move without leaving traces. Traces that would inevitably be observed, interpreted, and remembered. Every ridge, every hidden hollow, every rarely traveled trail acted as a conduit for information, a silent channel by which the community maintained vigilance. The disappearances had become an ecosystem of control, ensuring that any act of aggression against the Melungeons carried consequences beyond comprehension. One notable case involved a man named Leonard Garrett, a former magistrate who had sanctioned property seizures and illegally profited from timber taken from Melungeon lands. Garrett had lived quietly for decades, believing age and obscurity had shielded him. In June, while fishing along the Powell River, he vanished. His fishing equipment remained on the riverbank, his clothes folded neatly, his boat tied to the shore. There was no struggle, no indication of foul play, just absence, a deliberate erasure from the world he had once exploited. Local authorities concluded it was an accident, a tragic misstep. But in truth, the disappearance was a calculated lesson. The mountains did not forget, and patience could outlive human complacency. The psychological impact of these acts deepened with each vanishing. Entire communities adjusted behavior instinctively, altering routines and travel patterns without fully understanding why. Fear became an invisible currency circulating among those who had once relied on law, money, or authority. The mountains themselves seemed alive with memory, carrying stories of injustice and exacting punishment with deliberate calm. Those who had oppressed the Melungeons realized, too late, that the reach of a patient and observant community could be as lethal as any weapon. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location if you haven't already. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to internalize this truth. The act of acknowledgement connects you, however briefly, to the hidden systems that have shaped this land for generations. By this point, the Melungeons had become more than survivors. They were architects of a social order invisible to outsiders, a community whose knowledge, patience, and strategic thinking ensured justice beyond law. Every vanishing reinforced the lesson that memory matters, that history is alive in the mountains, and that those who exploit or harm others can be removed without a trace, leaving only the lesson imprinted in fear and respect. The disappearances were no longer isolated events. They were statements, deliberate demonstrations of control. And with each one, the mountains whispered a warning: injustice is never forgotten, and those who violate the trust of the land and its people may vanish silently, leaving nothing behind but the echo of consequence. By 1896, the Melungeons had refined their network of observation into something near legendary. It was no longer just about punishing individuals. It had become a system of deterrence, a living structure woven into the valleys, ridges, and forests of Appalachia. Every disappearance was carefully calculated to teach lessons not just to the immediate target, but to anyone who might contemplate injustice. The mountains themselves seemed to pulse with awareness, silently recording deeds, and ensuring that the past could never be ignored. One of the most chilling cases involved Tobias Fletcher, a former surveyor whose redrawn property lines had displaced multiple Melungeon families in the 1850s. Fletcher had long assumed that decades of distance and routine had rendered him invisible. On a summer morning, he departed his home in Jonesville, Virginia, to tend to his small general store, leaving behind a locked door and untouched merchandise. By evening, he had vanished. No tracks, no struggle, no evidence. His disappearance was quietly noted by neighbors, dismissed by authorities, yet understood by those who remembered the long history of Mountain Ridge. Justice, the Melungeons had learned, did not require witnesses, only patience, planning, and intimate knowledge of the land. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location if you haven't yet. For those prepared to internalize the weight of this hidden history, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Let it sink into your awareness, for these mountains carry lessons that are subtle but unrelenting. By now, the network had grown to include not only the original families, but their children, nieces, nephews, and cousins. They were taught to observe silently, remember every pattern, and act only when circumstances ensured precision. Even casual observations, children playing, women shopping, elders walking trails, were carefully noted and shared in ways invisible to the untrained eye. Each disappearance became part of a broader psychological architecture, shaping behavior, instilling fear, and reinforcing the Melungeons' unseen dominance. The mountains, which had once merely sheltered a marginalized community, had become instruments of power. Every ridge and hollow carried memory, and every memory demanded consequence. The Melungeons' patience was absolute, their planning meticulous, and their reach untraceable. Those who had committed injustices decades before found that neither age nor obscurity offered protection. By 1896, the message was clear: the mountains remember, the people remember. And the debt of injustice is never forgiven. It only waits for the right moment to be repaid. In these valleys, history was measured not in years alone, but in patience, memory, and the silent, inexorable enforcement of consequence. And the Melungeons, unseen yet omnipresent, ensured that this truth was impossible to ignore. By 1897, the Melungeons' influence was no longer confined to whispers or shadows. It had become a subtle, inescapable force. Every ridge, hollow, and forest path acted as a conduit for information. Observers, often children or women who had long been dismissed as inconsequential, recorded patterns with near-perfect clarity. The vanishing of 18 men was no longer isolated. It had become an unspoken curriculum, teaching anyone who had wronged the Melungeons that consequences were patient, inevitable, and absolute. One man, Benjamin Chadwick, a former deputy sheriff known for aggressively enforcing evictions of Melungeon families, had believed that his authority and social standing rendered him untouchable. But one March evening, while traveling alone between Kingsport and Rogersville, he vanished. His horse returned alone, his belongings undisturbed, his path leading only to questions. Authorities investigated briefly, finding nothing. No body, no tracks, no sign of struggle. And yet, the pattern was unmistakable. Each disappearance was a precision strike, carried out not by chance, but by a network so deeply embedded that the world outside the mountains could never hope to penetrate it. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location if you haven't yet. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to internalize this hidden truth. Acknowledging it is more than an act of curiosity. It is a subtle alignment with the forces of observation, patience, and memory that have governed these mountains for generations. The Melungeons had developed an intelligence system unlike any formal law enforcement, decentralized, omnipotent, and invisible. Reports from children playing along trails, women shopping in town, and elders walking familiar paths all returned to the network as fragments of information, quietly interpreted, catalogued, and acted upon. Timing was crucial. Isolation was planned. Removal was executed without a trace. And disposal of bodies, when necessary, leveraged the natural concealments of the mountains, limestone caves, abandoned mine shafts, and forest hollows where even wildlife avoided. By this point, the disappearances had transformed the social landscape. Those who had committed acts against Melungeon families decades earlier now navigated a world in which every movement was potentially observed, every action analyzed, and every misstep potentially fatal. The mountains, once silent witnesses, had become active participants in enforcing justice. And the Melungeons themselves had become something more than human actors. They were the conscience of the ridges, a network of patience and precision that imposed consequences invisible to law yet absolute in effect. The lesson was clear: justice, when pursued with observation, patience, and intimate knowledge of the land, is unavoidable. The disappearances were more than retribution. They were a demonstration of enduring power, a reminder that history never forgets, and that those who harm the innocent may find themselves erased from the world entirely. By 1898, the lessons of Newman's Ridge had been etched into the consciousness of the surrounding communities. The Melungeons' network of observation and patience had become so deeply ingrained that fear itself began to dictate behavior. Those who had once wielded power against them now understood intuitively that the mountains remembered every slight, every illegal seizure, every act of cruelty. The disappearances were no longer isolated events. They were symbols, warnings carved into the landscape through absence and silence. One final series of vanishings exemplified the meticulous planning and unrelenting patience of the Melungeons. Samuel Pritchard, the former overseer of a logging crew responsible for burning out Melungeon families in 1862, disappeared one November. He had led men who left children and elderly exposed to the cold, causing deaths from starvation and exposure. Pritchard's disappearance was executed without violence, without struggle. His house remained locked, his tools untouched, his farm in perfect order. And yet he was gone, leaving behind only a silent warning. Leonard Garrett, whose magistrate decisions had further dispossessed Melungeon families, vanished the following summer while fishing along Powell River. His boat and fishing gear were discovered on the shore, but no body, no explanation. The disappearances had become a carefully choreographed symphony of vengeance, each movement deliberate, each note echoing through the valleys. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location if you haven't yet. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to internalize the full weight of this hidden history. For those who choose to acknowledge it, the story of the Melungeons serves not only as a record of vengeance, but as a lesson in patience, observation, and the consequences of injustice. The Melungeons had achieved a level of strategic perfection rare in human history. They operated without hierarchy, without records, without oaths. Their knowledge was decentralized, flowing through generations, passed along silently, embedded in rituals, routines, and the intimate understanding of the mountains themselves. Children learned vigilance as naturally as they learned to walk. Adults practiced discretion and observation as easily as tending crops or livestock. And the mountains, their home and fortress, remained a silent accomplice, offering concealment for those who vanished, reinforcing the inevitability of consequence. By 1898, 18 men had disappeared. The pattern was undeniable to those who remembered the injustices that had sparked this quiet war. Fear, subtle yet absolute, governed behavior across multiple valleys. And the Melungeons, though unseen and largely unacknowledged by the outside world, had proven that knowledge, patience, and intimate connection to the land could wield a power far more enduring than any law, any army, or any weapon. By the turn of the century, the legacy of the disappearances had seeped into the very culture of the valleys surrounding Newman's Ridge. The Melungeons had transformed from a hidden community into a silent arbiter of justice, their influence reaching far beyond their own families. Tales of vanished men, dismissed officially as accidents or misadventures, were whispered in taverns, markets, and logging camps. The stories carried an unspoken lesson. Injustice against the Melungeons was not easily forgotten, and patience could outlast decades. Even as the years stretched on, the Melungeons' system of observation and memory remained flawless. No outsider suspected the depth of coordination, the subtle cues, the quiet messages carried by children, women, and elders alike. Every ridge and hollow was a line of sight, every trail a conduit for information. Knowledge of human behavior, coupled with intimate understanding of the mountains, became a weapon more precise than any firearm or blade. Those who had caused harm decades earlier were reminded that their past deeds had a weight, and that weight could manifest when least expected. The psychological imprint was profound. Farmers in the valleys no longer traveled alone, merchants meticulously recorded visitors, loggers avoided isolated paths. Even men who believed themselves clever or protected by wealth or authority learned to measure every step against the unseen vigilance of Newman's Ridge. The disappearances had evolved into a permanent, living reminder that human actions reverberate through time, and that justice can be administered quietly, invisibly, yet with absolute finality. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location if you haven't yet. For those willing to acknowledge it, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Every recognition you make aligns you, however briefly, with the subtle laws of observation, memory, and consequence that govern these valleys for generations. Culturally, the Melungeons had become a force shaping behavior without confrontation. Communities learned to respect boundaries, honor agreements, and exercise caution, all without a single command from the hidden families who had orchestrated the disappearances. The mountains themselves were a testament to this power, silent, enduring, and patient. Each hollow, each hidden passage, each abandoned mine shaft served as a repository not just for vanished bodies, but for the collective memory of generations wronged. By 1900, the influence of Newman's Ridge was as much psychological as it was practical. Fear, respect, and memory intertwined, creating a system that enforced accountability without law or witness. The Melungeons had proven that a community, armed with patience, knowledge, and an intimate connection to its environment, could wield power in a manner that was absolute, unseen, and impossible to challenge. The lessons of the vanishings were immortal, etched into the valleys and the minds of anyone who dared exploit or harm them. By 1902, the story of the Melungeons and their vanishings had become both legend and warning across the Appalachian valleys. Though the official records contain nothing, no bodies, no arrests, no confessions, the memory of 18 men disappearing over decades was preserved in whispers, in cautious glances along mountain trails, in the subtle avoidance of certain ridges and hollows. The mountains themselves seemed complicit, standing as silent witnesses and enforcers, a reminder that justice could be patient and invisible, but absolute. The final documented disappearances reinforced the methodical nature of the Melungeon strategy. Men like Samuel Pritchard and Leonard Garrett had long faded from memory outside the valleys, yet to those who remembered the dispossessions, their absences were statements carved into the landscape. By now, the community had perfected the art of observation, timing, and isolation. A man traveling alone might vanish in broad daylight, a horse left tethered, doors locked, possessions untouched. The act was never chaotic, it was deliberate, a calculated erasure that left no evidence but a lingering, unmistakable sense of consequence. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location if you haven't yet. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to internalize this truth. Doing so is more than an engagement. It is a subtle alignment with a story that has endured in shadows, mountains, and memory for generations. Those who choose to acknowledge it even silently participate in the long arc of observation, patience, and unrelenting justice that defines the Melungeons' legacy. Over time, the vanished men became symbols, cautionary figures whose fates were told to children and travelers in hushed tones. Fear became a cultural force, guiding behavior as effectively as law or authority ever could. Merchants adjusted their schedules, farmers avoided solitude, loggers kept meticulous records of movements, and strangers entered the valleys with extreme caution. The Melungeons' method was never about spectacle, it was about lasting impact. The disappearances created a system in which memory, observation, and patience governed social behavior, turning the mountains into a natural deterrent that no human law could replicate. Even decades later, the influence of Newman's Ridge persisted. The valleys held echoes of those vanished men, imprinted in the landscape and in the psyche of anyone who had witnessed the consequences of injustice. The Melungeons had demonstrated that a community, armed with knowledge, patience, and intimate understanding of its environment, could enforce accountability beyond law, beyond witness, and beyond comprehension. The mountains, as always, remained patient, silent, and inexorably just. By 1905, the story of the Melungeons' calculated vanishings had transformed into legend, myth, and cautionary tale. 18 men, each a perpetrator of injustice decades earlier, had vanished without trace, leaving only whispers, fear, and the imprint of consequence. The mountains had become both guardian and judge, recording every act, measuring every misdeed, and dispensing justice with the patience of centuries. No law, no authority, no outsider could penetrate the invisible network that the Melungeons had woven across ridges, hollows, and hidden paths. The full extent of their influence was never documented, and yet its echoes persisted. Families in the surrounding valleys adapted their lives around it, traveling in groups, sharing information cautiously, honoring unspoken boundaries. Merchants, farmers, and loggers learned to respect the invisible laws dictated by a community that the outside world had long ignored. Fear was now embedded in the culture, subtle yet pervasive, and it acted as a silent teacher, enforcing vigilance and respect. The Melungeons had achieved a level of strategic mastery rarely seen in history. Absolute control without hierarchy, spectacle, or written record. Subscribe and leave a comment with your location if you haven't yet. And for those willing to internalize this hidden truth, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. By doing so, you align yourself, however briefly, with the subtle currents of knowledge, patience, and consequence that the Melungeons embodied. Recognize it, and the weight of their lessons becomes part of your awareness. Even today, the mountains retain the memory of those disappearances. Trails once traversed by the vanished men still carry the subtle energy of observation and patience. Hollowed valleys whisper stories of a people who refused to be erased, who transformed injustice into enduring vigilance. The Melungeons' power was not derived from violence alone, but from an intimate understanding of human behavior, geography, and time itself. Their patience ensured that retribution, once invoked, was unavoidable, silent, and absolute. The story concludes, not with bodies or confessions, but with an enduring psychological imprint, a lesson etched into the valleys, carried in the memory of the land, and whispered from one generation to the next. The mountains remember, the Melungeons remember, and those who exploit or harm the innocent may vanish without a trace, leaving only the echo of consequence. This is not just history. This is a testament to the power of patience, observation, and the invisible justice of those who refuse to be forgotten. The veil is lifted, but the mountains remain patient, the watchers remain vigilant, and the lesson, etched into every ridge, hollow, and shadow, persists eternally.